Seattle, 1964. The room was not built for fighting. It was a converted storage space behind a small school, no more than 12 feet across, with a low ceiling and a single exposed bulb that flickered when the door slammed. There were 7 men inside when it started. Bruce Lee never spoke publicly about what happened in that room. But one of the men, James DeMille, would later describe a moment he couldn't reconcile. He said the air changed before the first strike. Not because of Bruce, but because of the other man. He weighed over 300 pounds. A brawler, not a performer, not a student. Someone who had already hurt people in real fights. And he had come with a point to prove. Technique fails when weight arrives, he said. No one laughed. 9 seconds later, something happened that split the room. Not just physically, but psychologically. 2 men walked in with different beliefs about fighting. Only one of them left unchanged. The method Bruce used was never formally taught in his classes. And one of the witnesses would later admit, I don't think he wanted us to see that version of him. Seattle, 1964. By the time this incident occurred, Bruce Lee was no longer just another young instructor teaching basic forms to curious students. At 23, he had already begun dismantling expectations, quietly, but with consequences. He was teaching out of small, improvised spaces, backrooms, garages, converted storage areas like the one on University Way. Nothing about the environment suggested tradition. No polished floors, no ceremonial weapons mounted on walls, no lineage portraits watching over the room, just bodies, movement, and pressure. James DeMille, one of his early students, would later describe the training sessions as uncomfortable in a way most martial arts classes weren't. Not physically at first, but mentally. Bruce didn't ask students to memorize. He asked them a question. Why would you do that if a man is coming straight through you? He once asked, stopping a drill mid-motion. That question, simple on the surface, was already causing friction. At the time, martial arts in America, especially Chinese systems, were guarded. Instruction was selective. Forms were preserved carefully, often unchanged. Respect for tradition was not optional. It was structural. Bruce did not reject tradition outright, but he refused to treat it as unquestionable. He modified techniques, shortened movements, removed what he considered unnecessary, and more importantly, he tested everything, not in theory, but against resistance. This made him difficult to categorize. Some saw him as innovative. Others saw him as careless. Word began to circulate, not through advertisements, but through conversations. Quiet ones, among practitioners, among fighters. He says most of it won't work under pressure. He lets people challenge him. He doesn't move like the rest of them. These weren't compliments. In that environment, reputation was not built through demonstration alone. It was built and broken through confrontation. Private challenges were not unusual, but they were rarely discussed afterward. There was an understanding what happened in those rooms stayed there, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because outcomes carried consequences. For students, for teachers, for entire systems. Bruce understood this, but he continued anyway, not recklessly. Those who trained with him insist on that. He was controlled, deliberate even, but he did not avoid pressure. If anything, he moved toward it. Linda Lee would later mention that during this period, Bruce was obsessed with efficiency. Not speed for its own sake, but directness. He didn't want to win exchanges, she said. He wanted to end them. That mindset was still developing, because in 1964, Bruce had not yet fully refined what would later become Jeet Kune. He was in transition between systems, between identities. He still carried elements of Wing Chun, but he was already altering them, testing range, adjusting timing, questioning structure, and that made him vulnerable. Not physically in the obvious sense, but strategically. He was working with ideas that were not yet fully proven, against opponents who were not theoretical. Seattle, at the time, was not a controlled environment. It was a working city. Dock workers, laborers, servicemen, men accustomed to physical confrontation, not structured sparring. When disagreements escalated, they didn't follow rules. They closed distance. They applied weight. They ended things quickly. Bruce knew this, but knowing something and experiencing it are not the same. The challenge that would unfold in that small room was not important because it was dramatic. There was no crowd, no announcement, no official record. It mattered because of timing, because Bruce was still forming his understanding of what worked and what failed when resistance became real. And because the man who walked into that room did not represent a style. He represented pressure, the kind that does not hesitate, the kind that does not adjust for form or respect distance, the kind that forces decisions before there is time to think. DeMille would later reflect on that period with a level of clarity that only comes years afterward. He was fast. Everyone knew that, he said. But speed isn't the question when someone can just keep coming. There was no hostility in the way he said it, just observation. Because at that point, before the fight began, that question had not yet been answered. Not in that room, not against that kind of weight. No official record lists his name. That absence is consistent across accounts. Some of the men present would later claim they knew it, then hesitate when pressed. Others admitted they never asked. What remained consistent, what none of them disputed, was his size, his posture, and the way he carried certainty into the room. Over 300 pounds. Not soft weight, not the kind that slows a man down before he moves. Witnesses described his build as dense, thick through the shoulders, heavy through the chest, with forearms that looked used, not trained for display. There were small marks on his hands, knuckles that didn't sit evenly. James DeMille remembered noticing those first. That wasn't from hitting pads, he said years later. That was from hitting people. The man did not introduce himself with aggression. No raised voice. No attempt to dominate the room socially. He spoke once, briefly, and only after watching Bruce work with another student. Technique fails when weight arrives. He didn't say it as a challenge. He said it as a conclusion. That detail stayed with the witnesses. There was no performance in him, no attempt to provoke. If anything, his tone suggested he had already tested that belief and found no reason to doubt it. He had not come to learn. He had come to confirm something. There are fragments of background, though none fully verified. One account places him working near the docks. Another suggests time spent in bars where disputes were settled quickly and without witnesses. No one described him as a trained martial artist. No forms, no rank, no mention of structured instruction. But no one dismissed him either, because in that era, lack of formal training did not equal lack of danger. If anything, it removed hesitation. Men who fought outside systems did not pause to maintain structure. They closed distance. They grabbed. They drove forward until something gave balance, breath, or bone. And this man understood that dynamic well. One of the quieter witnesses, a student who rarely spoke during sessions, later described the moment Bruce first acknowledged him. They didn't circle each other like fighters, he said. It felt more like two people recognizing a problem. Bruce asked a question, not loudly but directly. You've tested that? The man nodded. No elaboración. No stories. No need to justify himself. That exchange set the tone. Because this wasn't a situation where one man underestimated the other. There was no visible arrogance from Bruce, and no theatrical hostility from the challenger. What existed instead was a conflict of conclusions. Bruce believed efficiency, timing, and interception could neutralize size, if applied correctly. The challenger believed that once contact was made, those advantages would collapse under pressure. Both positions had evidence behind them, but not against each other. That's what made the encounter necessary. Not for reputation, not in the public sense. There was no audience beyond the room, no promotion, no outcome to display. But internally, for both men, there was something at stake. For Bruce, it was the validity of ideas he was still shaping. Ideas that rejected excess movement, that prioritized directness, that assumed control could be maintained through precision, even against larger opponents. For the challenger, it was simpler. He had lived a version of fighting where size ended arguments, where speed mattered only until it met mass, where the outcome was decided when space disappeared. He wasn't there to debate that. He was there to apply it. DeMille would later describe a subtle shift in Bruce's demeanor once the man stopped speaking. He got quieter, he said. Not nervous, just more exact. like he was measuring something. That observation matters, because it suggests Bruce did not dismiss the statement. He took it seriously, and in doing so, he accepted something most instructors at the time would have avoided, especially in a small, uncontrolled space. He allowed the question to become physical. No referé, no structure, no guarantee of clean exchanges, just a confined room, and a man whose entire argument depended on getting close enough to prove it. What made the challenger credible was not just his size. It was his patience. He didn't rush forward. He didn't demand immediate action. He waited, standing still, conserving energy, watching how Bruce moved with others, as if he were already calculating distance, as if he understood that once the first step was taken, there would be no pause to adjust, only contact. And after that, no one in that room could say, with certainty, what would hold. The room was cleared without discussion. It wasn't announced as preparation for a fight. No one said, "Make space." But students moved instinctively, stepping back, lifting bags, shifting a bench against the wall. Within a minute, the center of the room was open. Not wide, just enough for two men to move without immediately colliding with furniture. 12 feet across at most. The floor was wood, worn in patches where shoes had dragged over time. No mutts, no padding. If someone went down hard, the surface would not absorb it. The single overhead bulb cast uneven light. One corner remained dim. Shadows collected there, making distance harder to judge from certain angles. DeMille later mentioned that detail specifically. You couldn't see depth properly from the side, he said. If you misjudged a step, you felt it. There were no formal rules spoken. That absence was not unusual, but it carried weight. In structured sparring, even hard sparring, there's an unspoken rhythm, a boundary that both participants recognize. Here, that boundary was undefined. Bruce did not outline restrictions. He didn't say light contact or control. He didn't mention targets or limits. He simply stepped forward and removed his jacket. That was the closest thing to a signal. The challenger did not change his posture. He remained where he had been standing, near the far side of the room, feet set slightly apart. Not in a formal stance, but balanced. His hands were low, relaxed. Not careless, just untrained in appearance. But his eyes did not drift. He watched Bruce's center. That detail unsettled one of the younger students. Years later, he recalled it with discomfort. Most people watch the hands, he said. He wasn't. He was watching the body like he was waiting for it to move. Positions were taken along the walls. No one sat now. The earlier casual posture had shifted into something tighter. Arms folded, shoulders against wood. The distance between observers and participants was minimal, 3 feet in some places. Close enough to hear breath change. Close enough to see impact clearly. DeMille stood to the left of the doorway. From there, he had a partial side angle. Enough to see footwork, but not always the initial line of attack. Another student, Taiki Kimura, stood further back, near the dim corner. His view was more obstructed, but he would later say the sound told him more than the sight. There's a difference, Kimura said, between controlled contact and something else. You hear it first. The door behind them remained closed. No one entered. No one left. Bruce stepped into range, not aggressively, but with intent. His stance was narrower than what some students were used to seeing. Weight slightly forward. Hands positioned not for display, but for interception. His breathing was controlled. But those who knew him well noticed something subtle. He wasn't relaxed. Not tense in a visible way. No stiffness in his shoulders. No hesitation in his movement. But there was less fluidity in the small adjustments he usually made before engaging. Less rhythm. More focus. It suggested calculation. The challenger shifted his weight once, barely noticeable, but enough to test the floor. His right foot slid half an inch, heel settling. Not a step, just confirmation of footing. He said nothing. That silence affected the room more than any verbal exchange could have. It removed any remaining sense of demonstration. There would be no explanation during or after. No breakdown. No teaching moment. Just outcome. Bruce raised his lead hand slightly. Not a signal to begin, but an acknowledgement. The challenger responded by moving forward one step. No feint, no setup, just distance closing. The air changed immediately. Witnesses described it not as tension, but compression, as if the room had reduced in size without anything physically shifting. Breathing became more noticeable. Small sounds, fabric moving, a shoe adjusting against wood, felt amplified. There was no countdown, no mutual noth, just proximity reaching a point where action could no longer be delayed. DeMille would later summarize the moment with unusual restraint. It wasn't a fight yet, he said, but it wasn't anything else either. Bruce's eyes locked, not on the man's face, but slightly lower. Tracking center mass, calculating entry points, angles, timing, because he understood what the first second would determine. Against someone that size, space was not neutral. It was temporary, and once it disappeared, regaining it would not be guaranteed. The challenger took another step. Closer now, inside a range where reaction time shrinks, where intention becomes movement, and movement becomes contact. The first movement came without warning. No shift in breath. No visible properación. The challenger stepped in hard, left foot driving forward, upper body following without hesitation. It wasn't fast in the conventional sense, but it didn't need to be. It was committed. Distance collapsed in less than a second. Bruce reacted at the moment of entry, not before. His lead hand snapped forward, not as a strike in isolation, but as an interception. A straight-line punch aimed at the face, timed to meet forward motion. Contact. A sharp, compact impact, knuckles against cheekbone. The sound carried, not loud, but distinct enough that Kimura, standing near the dim corner, turned his head slightly, as if to confirm what he'd heard. The challenger's head shifted half an inch to the side, but his body did not stop. That was the first break in expectation. Most exchanges Bruce had tested until that point involved reaction, opponents pausing, adjusting, or resetting after being hit cleanly. This man didn't. The strike registered, but it didn't interrupt forward pressure. If anything, it accelerated it. A second step drove him closer, chest now within arm's reach. His right arm began to rise, not in a precise arc, but in a broad, heavy motion aimed toward Bruce's upper body. Bruce adjusted instantly. His rear foot slid back just enough to create a fraction of space. Not retreat, repositioning. His left hand retracted and redirected, shifting from offense to control, aiming to deflect the incoming arm at the forearm level. Contact again, this time not clean. The deflection worked, but partially. The challenger's arm didn't land directly, but the force carried through, glancing off Bruce's shoulder. Enough to shift balance slightly. Enough to register weight. DeMille saw that clearly. He felt it, he said. You could see it in the step. Bruce's stance tightened. He fired again, another straight punch, shorter this time, aimed lower. The target shifted from face to throat line. Less reach required. More direct. Impact. This one caused a visible reaction. The challenger's head pulled back slightly, chin lifting. A disruption. Brief. But again, not decisive. Because the distance was already gone. The challenger's left hand came forward, not as a strike, but as a grab. Fingers closing toward Bruce's upper arm, aiming to establish contact that couldn't be easily broken. Bruce twisted his torso, rotating just enough to slip the full grip. The hand caught fabric instead of muscle, his shirt pulling tight across the shoulder. For a fraction of a second, both men were connected. Not exchanging strikes, attached. That changed the dynamic immediately. Bruce attempted to disengage, foot shifting laterally, aiming to create angle. His right hand moved again, not for a full extension punch this time, but a shorter, snapping motion toward the jawline. The space wasn't there. The strike landed but compressed. No full extension. Reduced effect. The challenger absorbed it. And then he moved again. Forward. Not faster, but heavier. His right shoulder drove inward, closing the last inches of space. His body weight transferred fully into the movement, pressing into Bruce's center line. Bruce stepped back, once then again. Each step controlled, but forced. The room seemed smaller now. Witnesses along the wall adjusted their stance without realizing it. One student leaned back further than the wall allowed, shoulder pressing hard into wood. Because the exchange had shifted. This was no longer about landing first. It was about staying upright. Bruce's breathing changed, subtly but noticeably. Shorter exhales, more frequent. He fired one more interception, this time a downward strike toward the collarbone as the challenger advanced again. It landed, but the effect was the same. Minimal interruption. The pattern was becoming clear. Speed created openings, but not separation. Precision created contact, but not control. And with each step forward, the challenger was solving the same problem in the simplest way possible. He was removing space. DeMile's account of that moment remained consistent over the years. He hit him clean, he said, more than once. But it didn't change the direction of the fight. Bruce adjusted again, this time lowering his center of gravity slightly, knees bending, stance widening by a fraction. A preparation, not for another strike, for resistance, because the next second would not allow for distance. And once the challenger fully established contact, the exchange would no longer be about speed at all. The third forward drive changed everything. The challenger didn't rush it. He stepped in with the same measured commitment. But this time, his timing aligned with Bruce's adjustment. As Bruce lowered his base, preparing to resist, the distance disappeared completely. Contact became constant. Chest to shoulder, forearm to bicep. The challenger's left arm secured fabric again. This time deeper, fingers hooking behind the upper sleeve. His right arm came across, not striking, but pressing inward across Bruce's upper torso, collapsing space further. It wasn't a clean clinch. It was heavier than that. Bruce's back foot slid half an inch on the wood. Grip lost traction, then caught again. DeMille saw the shift immediately. That's where it got dangerous, he said. Not the hits, the weight. Bruce attempted to pivot, left foot stepping outward to create angle. His torso rotated, trying to redirect the forward pressure instead of meeting it directly. For a moment, it worked. The challenger's line shifted slightly off-center, but not enough, because the man adjusted instinctively, not by stepping back, but by leaning in harder. His weight followed the movement, closing the angle before Bruce could exploit it. A forearm drove into Bruce's chest, not a strike, but a compression. Air pushed out in a short, audible exhale. Bruce's right hand came up again, short strike toward the jawline. It landed, but now the position had changed too much. No extension, no snap. The impact was absorbed at close range. The challenger didn't react. Instead, his right arm dropped lower, wrapping partially around Bruce's side. Not a full hold, but enough to threaten control. Enough to limit movement. Bruce's back foot hit the edge of the room, not the wall, but close enough that one more step would remove his ability to retreat. That was the first moment where his options narrowed visibly. Kimura would later describe it simply. He couldn't move the way he wanted anymore. Bruce tried to break the grip, left hand driving down against the challenger's forearm, attempting to strip it away. At the same time, he shifted his hips, trying to create space between their centers. The effort showed, not strain, but urgency. Because this wasn't a position he could stay in. The challenger tightened his hold, not technically, but effectively. His weight pressed forward again, forcing Bruce's upper body slightly backward. Balance compromised. For a fraction of a second, Bruce's posture broke alignment. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. DeMille noticed it. His head came back just a little, he said. That's when you knew. This wasn't controlled anymore. The challenger began to drive again, forward and slightly downward. Not a throw, not a takedown in the formal sense. Just pressure aimed at collapsing structure. Bruce's heel brushed the wall. Contact. No more space behind him. That was the edge. And in that moment, something changed. Witnesses struggled to describe it later. Not because it was unclear, but because it was brief. A shift in intent more than movement. Bruce stopped trying to disengage. Instead, he moved in. A small step forward into the pressure. Unexpected. It disrupted the challenger's balance. Not by force, but by altering distance. The forward drive met less resistance than anticipated, causing a slight overcommitment. That opening lasted less than a second. Bruce used it. His left hand shot upward. Not toward the face this time, but inside the challenger's line, targeting the throat. Not a full extension strike, but a sharp, direct thrust. At the same time, his right hand drove downward and inward toward the groin. 2 targets. 2 lines. No hosetaschen. Contact. Immediate reaction. The challenger's body seized. Not dramatically, but enough. His forward pressure stopped. His grip loosened. Air caught. A sound, short, involuntary. Bruce did not follow with additional strikes. He stepped back. Just 1 step. But it was enough to break contact completely. The room went silent. Not from impact, but from recognition. What had just happened was not part of training. It wasn't a combination taught in class. It wasn't structured. It was direct, efficient, and final. The challenger remained standing, but his posture had changed. Shoulders slightly forward, breath uneven, hands lowered, not by choice but by necessity. He did not re-engage. Not immediately. Bruce stood still. No raise guard. No follow-up movement. Just watching. DeMille would later describe Bruce's expression, not in detail, but in tone. He didn't look angry, he said. He looked controlled. But there was something else there. Like he knew exactly what that could have done. Because the targets he chose were not neutral. The throat, the groin, both capable of ending more than just a fight. And Bruce had used them without hesitation. At the exact moment, he was closest to losing positional control. That was the decision. Not just to win, but to end the exchange immediately at a level that carried consequences. The challenger took a step back. Then another. No words. No acknowledgement. Just distance. And in that space, the tension didn't release. It shifted from physical danger to something quieter, more difficult to name. No one moved at first. The distance between them held 3, maybe 4 feet now, but it felt wider. Not because of space, but because the exchange had ended in a way no one in the room had expected. The challenger straightened slowly. Not fully. His shoulders remained slightly forward, breath still uneven. His right hand hovered briefly near his midsection before dropping again. He didn't look at Bruce immediately. His eyes stayed low, focused somewhere between the floor and the space where contact had just broken. There was no collapse, no dramatic fall, but there was a clear decision. He wasn't continuing. DeMille would later say that moment mattered more than the strikes. Guys like that don't stop unless something tells them to, he said. And it wasn't talk that stopped him. Bruce didn't advance. He didn't reset his stance or raise his guard again. His hands lowered, not casually but deliberately. The fight had ended, and he chose not to reopen it. That restraint registered with the room, because everyone present understood what had just been used. The targets weren't accidental. They weren't part of controlled sparring. They were selections made under pressure, when options had narrowed and time had shortened. Kimura described the silence that followed as uncomfortable. Not because anyone was hurt badly, he said, but because we all knew that could have gone further. The challenger took another step back, creating more space. This time he lifted his head slightly, meeting Bruce's eyes for the first time since the exchange ended. There was no visible anger, no demand for continuation, just acknowledgement. A brief nod, small enough that some in the room missed it. Then he turned and walked toward the door. No one blocked him. No one spoke. The door opened, light from the hallway cutting briefly across the dim room, then closed again with a dull, flat sound. And just like that, it was over. But the atmosphere didn't reset. Students remained where they were, pressed lightly against the walls, as if stepping forward too quickly would break something that hadn't fully settled. Bruce moved first, not toward anyone, but back to the center of the room. He picked up his jacket, paused for a moment, then folded it over his arm. His breathing had returned to normal, but there was a stillness in him that hadn't been there before the exchange. DeMille approached cautiously, not with questions, but with observation. "You okay?" he asked. Bruce nodded once. No explanation followed. That absence became part of the story, because in the days after, he didn't revisit the encounter in detail. He didn't reconstruct the movements or use it as a teaching example. There was no demonstration of what worked. But something in his training changed. Subtly at first, then more clearly. Students began to notice shorter movements, less tolerance for wide techniques, a sharper emphasis on interception, not as theory, but as necessity. He corrected distance more aggressively, stopped drills earlier when structure broke down, and when discussions turned to size, because they inevitably did, his responses became more precise, not dismissive, measured, as if the question had been answered, but not in a way that allowed for simple conclusions. Linda would later reflect on that period with a detail that didn't appear in public interviews. He didn't talk about winning, she said. He talked about timing and what happens when you're late. That shift mattered, because before that night, Bruce was building a system based on efficiency. After it, he began refining it against consequence. The difference is subtle, but critical. One assumes control. The other prepares for its loss. Those who were in the room carried the memory differently. Some focused on the speed, others on the size difference. But the ones who stayed closest to Bruce over the years remembered something else entirely. The moment he chose to end it. Not earlier, when he had space. Not later, when control might have been fully lost. But at the exact point where hesitation would have changed the outcome. DeMille summarized it years later, in a way that avoided admiration. He didn't win because he was faster, he said. He won because he decided sooner. There was no official record of the encounter. No written account at the time. Just recollections, fragmented, sometimes inconsistent, but aligned on one detail. Bruce never demonstrated that combination in class afterward. Not the throat, not the groin, not together, as if it belonged to a different category of movement, one that existed outside teaching, outside structure, outside control. And maybe that was the part that stayed with him. Not that he could use it, but that he had. The strongest man in that room wasn't the one who landed first. It was the one who understood, in a fraction of a second, exactly how far he was willing to go. And stopped there. 0.